Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? When we think of kings from the Middle Ages, we often imagine gallant warriors, wise rulers, and defenders of faith. But history, if we dare to look behind the gilded doors of their courts, reveals something far less noble. Some monarchs were not driven by duty or divine purpose, but by insatiable desires that turned their reigns into spectacles of excess and scandal. Take King Philip IV of France, known to his contemporaries not for great governance, but for his obsession with pleasure. His court was infamous for its decadent feasts, masked balls, and secret gatherings where morality seemed to vanish as quickly as the wine flowed. Chroniclers whispered of nights where courtiers and lovers alike were summoned to hidden chambers, and where the king's power was exercised as much in the bedroom as in the council chamber. Then there was Alfonso IX, of whose reputation for indulgence and debauchery outlived him by centuries. He filled his palace with mistresses, openly defied the church's teachings on chastity, and fathered an astonishing number of illegitimate children. His contemporaries were both shocked and fascinated, for in a time when kings were expected to uphold virtue publicly, Alfonso flaunted his sins with brazen confidence. To many, he embodied the dangerous truth that power without restraint can turn rulers into predators. Such stories were not confined to distant rumor. They became the subject of songs, poems, and whispered tales across Europe. For the common people, these kings were living contradictions, figures who claimed divine right to rule while wallowing in very human vice. Their behavior eroded the aura of sanctity that monarchy so carefully cultivated, reminding everyone that behind the crown sat men with desires as base as any peasant, essentially magnified by limitless power. Power can corrupt, but when mixed with unrestrained desire, it can become something far darker. Medieval Europe witnessed kings whose lust didn't just stain their reputations, it shaped their politics, their courts, and even the fates of nations. Consider King Charles II of Navarre, known to history as Charles the Bad. While his political maneuvering earned him enemies across Europe, his personal life was equally notorious. Chroniclers accused him of indulging in sadistic pleasures, taking advantage of both men and women in his court with ruthless disregard for their consent. In a world where kings were untouchable, his predations went unchecked, leaving a trail of fear and resentment that outlived his reign. Then there was Francis I of France, a monarch whose charm and charisma masked an insatiable appetite for women. He filled his court with mistresses, some of whom wielded enormous political influence because of their intimate access to him. His lovers were rewarded with lands, titles, and wealth, while rivals who opposed him often found themselves mysteriously disgraced or exiled. To his admirers, he was the embodiment of Renaissance passion. To his critics, he was a ruler enslaved by his own lust. Even in England, the pattern repeated. Edward II's reign was plagued by controversy not only because of his favoritism toward male companions, but also because of the lavish rewards he showered upon them, angering the nobility and destabilizing the kingdom. His intimate relationships, while consensual, were weaponized by his enemies, who painted him as a degenerate unfit to rule. The line between private desire and public responsibility blurred, until it ultimately contributed to his downfall. What these stories reveal is that medieval kings often used their absolute power to pursue their desires unchecked. Their personal cravings didn't remain behind closed doors, they spilled into the fabric of governance, influencing decisions that affected millions. And for those who lived under their rule, the consequences of royal lust could be as devastating as war or famine. There are moments in history when royal desire crossed into outright tyranny, when kings stopped merely indulging in pleasure and began using their power to satisfy their darkest cravings. Take King John of England, remembered as one of the most reviled rulers in English history. Beyond his political failures, contemporary accounts accused him of forcing noble women and even nuns into his bed, using coercion and threats to get what he wanted. His relentless abuses earned him hatred so deep that barons rose in rebellion, leading to the creation of the Magna Carta document, born partly out of the need to curb a king's unchecked appetites. In Castile, King Alfonso XI had a reputation for taking mistresses by the dozens, but what made him infamous was his favoritism toward them. While his legitimate queen languished in political obscurity, his lovers and their families prospered. His court became a theater of jealousy, intrigue, and power struggles, all fueled by his insatiable desire. But perhaps no story captures the descent into pure depravity quite like that of King Valdemar IV of Denmark. Known as Valdemar Atterdag, he was accused of abducting young women from across his realm, keeping them imprisoned in his castle for his personal gratification. While some of these tales may have been exaggerated by his enemies, The sheer persistence of the rumors speaks volumes about how his rule was perceived, not as a reign of justice but as a reign of fear cloaked in sexual exploitation. These were not mere scandals, they were weapons. In the hands of kings, lust became a political force, reshaping alliances, toppling governments, and leaving behind legacies stained not just by misrule but by moral corruption. For those who suffered under their whims, royal desire was not a distant rumor, it was a daily nightmare. If lust could destroy a court, it could also destroy entire kingdoms. Some rulers allowed their obsessions to grow so twisted that they reshaped the very fabric of their reigns. Consider King Eric XIV of Sweden, whose desire and paranoia mixed into a volatile cocktail. He was known for seducing women of noble birth, but when rumors of infidelity reached him, his jealousy turned murderous. He had rivals executed, including members of his own court, in a frenzy of suspicion. His reign became a chilling reminder of how personal vice can metastasize into state terror. In Naples, King Ferdinand I maintained a secret pleasure house where women were brought to entertain him, often against their will. His voracious appetite was so notorious that foreign envoys wrote of it in disgust, describing a ruler consumed by indulgence. While his kingdom teetered on instability, pleasure for him was not a private sin, it was a public policy of exploitation. And then there was Władysław II of Bohemia, whose rule was shadowed by tales of his predatory behavior. Chronicles suggest that his court became a hunting ground, where no woman was truly safe from the king's advances. While some modern historians argue these accounts may have been politically motivated, they nevertheless reflect how his contemporaries viewed him, as a ruler who saw power not as a responsibility, but as a license for depravity. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When unchecked power meets unrestrained desire, tyranny often follows. Behind the gilded walls of palaces, beneath the splendor of crowns and ceremonies, there existed a darkness, one that devoured lives, corrupted states, and left scars on history itself. History shows us that some monarchs allowed their desires to grow so excessive that pleasure itself became their sole pursuit. For these rulers, governance was secondary, almost a distraction from the endless indulgence of their appetites. Take King Henry III of Castile, who was said to have surrounded himself with an ever-changing court of young women, entertainers, and sick. Chroniclers describe his palace as less a seat of power and more a theater of lust, where plays, feasts, and dances often ended in secret chambers. What disturbed his contemporaries most was not merely his adultery but the way he squandered royal resources to maintain this life of spectacle, while his people suffered through famine and plague. Another striking figure was King Sigismund of Poland and Hungary, a ruler whose hunger for carnal pleasure was matched only by his love of luxury. He spent vast sums importing perfumes, silks, and rare aphrodisiacs, turning his court into a place where indulgence dripped from every wall. Rumors claimed that Sigismund believed sensual delight to be a sign of divine favor, using this as justification to excuse his behavior. To his critics, however, it was nothing more than a thin veil covering unchecked hedonism. But perhaps the most notorious of all was King Christian VII of Denmark. Unlike many rulers whose excesses were hidden behind heavy curtains, Christian's wild behavior was impossible to conceal. He was infamous for wandering the streets at night, engaging in public debauchery, and surrounding himself with companions who fueled his obsessions. His reign was marked by instability, for while his ministers attempted to govern, the king spiraled into self-destructive indulgence. His excesses became not only scandalous but politically dangerous, undermining the stability of the Danish crown itself. These monarchs remind us that when desire evolves into obsession, it does not remain a private matter. It consumes courts, drains treasuries, and destabilizes kingdoms. The crown, once a symbol of divine order, becomes instead a mask for chaos, a glittering disguise worn by men who rule not through justice, but through the tyranny of their passions. The deeper we look into medieval courts, the clearer it becomes that desire was not just a weakness of certain rulers, it was an infection that spread through dynasties, corrupting the very heart of monarchy itself. Some kings became so consumed by lust that their rule is remembered less for laws or battles, and more for the chaos their appetites unleashed. Consider King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, whose reign was so infamous for debauchery that even the chroniclers of his time struggled to find words strong enough to condemn him. He turned his court into a den of drunken revelry, where wine and women flowed endlessly. Nobles complained that royal councils were abandoned for wild banquets, and justice delayed because the king was lost in his pleasures. His neglect bred discontent, and rebellions erupted as his kingdom rotted under the weight of his indulgence. In France, Louis XV, though technically beyond the medieval period, embodied the same pattern of royal corruption born of lust. Known as Louis the Well-Beloved, he maintained an elaborate network of mistresses, the most notorious being the famous Madame de Pompadour. Later in his life, he established a hidden residence known as the Perverse, where young women were brought for his enjoyment, many of them little more than teenagers. To the people of France, starving and overtaxed, his extravagance was nothing short of an insult. Though remembered as a monarch of refinement, his private life became a festering symbol of royal excess that foreshadowed the coming revolution. Even beyond Europe, similar tales can be found. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire, remembered by history as Ibrahim the Mad, turned his harem into an empire within the empire. His lusts were extravagant, bizarre, and often cruelly demanded women be chosen not only for beauty but for peculiar traits that matched his fleeting obsessions. Chroniclers record that his excesses bankrupted the state treasury, as endless wealth was funneled into his insatiable desires. His reign ended violently, with his own court turning against him, proving that unchecked lust could topple even the most powerful sovereign. These rulers, despite their differences in time and place, shared one haunting truth. Their thrones were not seats of responsibility, but stages upon which their obsessions played out. For their subjects, desire was not a private matter of the king's bedchamber, it was a storm that could alter the fate of nations. History teaches us that lust, when fused with absolute power, can deform kings into something far more terrifying than flawed men. It can turn them into predators who ruled not with wisdom, but with hunger. Some monarchs reached such extremes that their names remain etched into chronicles, not as leaders, but as cautionary tales of corruption and desire. Take King Christian VII of Denmark, whose reign became infamous for its instability. Though mentally fragile, he indulged in endless carnal pursuits, surrounding himself with prostitutes and courtiers who encouraged his vices. The Danish court descended into chaos, its politics overshadowed by the king's obsessions. Ministers schemed, nobles whispered, and the people watched as the crown, instead of guiding the nation, sank into scandal. Then there was Henry VIII of England, remembered not only for his turbulent marriages, but also for the ruthless way he pursued his desires. 6 queens stood by his side, but countless women passed through his bed, their fates tied to the whims of a monarch who believed divine right justified everything. When Catherine of Aragon would not give him a son, he tore England away from the Catholic Church. When Anne Boleyn lost his favor, she was executed under charges many historians believe were fabricated. In Henry, lust did not only destroy marriages, it reshaped an entire kingdom, creating ripples that would echo for centuries. Even further east, Tsar Ivan IV of Russia, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible, turned his palace into a labyrinth of fear, where women were taken at his command and discarded just as quickly. His paranoia fed his cruelty. Lovers accused of betrayal were punished with unspeakable brutality. His personal life mirrored his reign, volatile, violent, and drenched in blood. For Ivan, lust was never tender, it was another weapon, as sharp as the sword he wielded against his enemies. These kings remind us that unchecked desire could twist monarchs into tyrants whose private indulgences bled into public life. Their lusts did not remain behind closed doors, they became national tragedies, reshaping religion, politics, and the very destinies of their people. If earlier tales revealed kings corrupted by desire, here we descend into the very pit of human darkness where royal lust was so unrestrained, it scarred not just courts, but entire nations. These were rulers who turned pleasure into cruelty, and whose appetites made monsters of men. Consider Peter the Cruel of Castile, whose very name carried the echo of his brutality. His court was not a place of elegance or refinement, but a stage for violence and lust. Chroniclers wrote of women brought to him unwillingly, their fates sealed by his unchecked desire. To resist was unthinkable. Peter's wrath was swift, and his punishment merciless. For his subjects, he was less a king and more a looming terror whose cravings shaped their lives. Then there was Charles VI of France, remembered as Charles the Mad. His mental instability, combined with dangerous impulses, created a court haunted by fear. He became obsessed with women, summoning them under the guise of entertainment only to lose himself in fits of wild indulgence or sudden rage. Nobles, priests, and even family members watched helplessly as the king's private madness became a public curse, dragging France deeper into chaos during the 100 Years' War. In Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus projected the image of a cultured Renaissance monarch, a patron of art and learning. But behind the polished facade lurked a voracious hunger. Rumors whispered through his court that he kept secret chambers filled with concubines, where politics and passion collided. Some of these women were elevated to positions of influence, while others vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only shadows and suspicion. His reign reminds us that the glitter of Renaissance brilliance could still conceal medieval darkness. Perhaps most chilling of all was Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman and companion-in-arms of Joan of Arc, who later became one of history's most infamous figures. Though not a king, his wealth and power gave him near-royal authority in his lands. His crimes were so grotesque: abductions, unspeakable acts, and the deaths of countless children that they haunt history to this day. Gilles shows us what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a man completely consumed by twisted desire. These stories stand at the edge of horror and history. They remind us that behind the jewels, the thrones, and the splendor of palaces, there were rulers whose lust was not a private indulgence, but a public catastrophe. The darker their cravings grew, the more their kingdoms trembled under the weight of their. As we reach the darkest corners of medieval history, the tales grow heavier, the shadows longer. These were kings whose reigns became cautionary legends, examples of what happens when unchecked lust devours both man and monarchy. Take Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Hungary. He styled himself as a great statesman and warrior, yet his private life was infamous for cruelty. Chronicles accuse him of abducting noble women and using them as pawns in his games of lust and humiliation. His court, far from being a beacon of Christian virtue, became whispered about as a place where morality was mocked and power fed only desire. In Portugal, King Afonso V was celebrated as the African for his campaigns abroad, but within his palace walls, stories told of an appetite that blurred all lines of decency. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, and even young pages lived in fear of being summoned to the king's chambers, where refusal was not an option. His lust, veiled in the trappings of royal privilege, scarred lives and left stains that the chronicles of glory could not erase. And then there was Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, remembered not for wisdom or governance, but for his debauchery. He was said to spend nights in drunken revelry, dragging nobles and peasants alike into orgies that mocked the church and scandalized Europe. His neglect of duty plunged his kingdom into disarray, proving that indulgence at the top can unravel the stability of an entire realm. Each of these kings lived in palaces that glittered with gold, but beneath the shine lurked a rot that spread through their courts and into the lives of their subjects. They were men who mistook their crowns for a license to surrender fully to their desires, and in doing so, they poisoned the very foundations of their rule. History often polishes its kings, casting them as heroes, saviors, or chosen by divine will. Yet, when we peel away the glitter of crowns and the solemnity of ceremonies, we find that many of them were not guided by wisdom, justice, or piety, but by the same impulses that dwell in every human heart. The difference is that, for kings, those impulses were magnified by absolute power. Lust unchecked became tyranny. Desire without restraint turned palaces into prisons for the innocent, and indulgence without conscience corroded kingdoms from within. These rulers remind us of a haunting truth. The greatest threat to a throne is often not invasion, famine, or rebellion, but the human weakness seated upon it. Their lives serve as cautionary tales, not merely of individuals consumed by vice, but of systems that allowed one person's cravings to shape the fate of millions. Behind their jeweled crowns were fragile men, prisoners of their own appetites, who mistook indulgence for freedom only to leave behind legacies of ruin. And so we are left with a question that reaches beyond the Middle Ages and into our own time. If power can so easily magnify human weakness, can any ruler or any of us truly resist the temptations that come with it?